Subal Chandra's son was called Sushil Chandra, but people always aren't true to their names, which is why perhaps Subal, whose name means the strong one, was actually quite weak, and Sushil, which means gentle and quiet, was just the opposite. The son Sushil drove the entire neighborhood mad with his antics. This made his father itch to punish him. Unfortunately, the father suffered from rheumatism, while the son could run like a deer. So, most of the intended slaps missed their target. But on the rare occasions when his father managed to catch him, Sushil really had a bad time. The day on which this story begins was a Saturday, and school would be over by 2 in the afternoon. But Sushil was in no mood to go to school for a number of reasons. To start with, it was the day of the dreaded geography test. Secondly, there was to be a display of fireworks at the Boses that evening, which everyone was looking forward to. Sushil, too, longed to spend the day watching every bit of the preparation. After thinking long and hard about it, Sushil jumped into bed just when it was time to go to school. Subal looked at him in surprise and asked him, "Why are you still in bed? Aren't you going to school?"
"I have a terrible stomachache,"
said Sushil promptly. Subal saw through the trick at once and said to himself, "Very well, I know how to teach you a lesson." He turned to Sushil. "A stomachache, eh? You'd better stay in bed then. You are not to go anywhere. I had bought some lozenges for you, but you'd better not have them. Just lie down quietly while I go and prepare a brew for your stomachache." Subal locked his son in and went off to prepare a bowl of a really bitter brew. Sushil was in a quandary. He loved lozenges and loathed the brews his father made, and he was dying to go to the Boses. But now there seemed to be no chance. When Subal returned to the room with a big bowl of bitter brew, Sushil jumped out of bed saying, "I am fine now. My stomachache is gone. I am going to school." "You are not going out anywhere today," said Subal. "Drink this and lie here quietly for the rest of the day." He forced the brew down Sushil's reluctant throat, locked the door from outside, and left. Sushil burst into tears and wept buckets the whole day long. He told himself, "If only I could be as old as my father, I'd be able to do whatever I wanted to." Subal sat outside and thought, "My parents pampered me so much when I was young. I could never study as much as I ought to have done. If only I could be young once again, I'd spend all my time studying hard." And it so happened that the goddess who grants wishes was passing by just then. She heard both Subal and Sushil and decided to grant them both their wishes. Appearing before Subal, she said,
"Tomorrow morning, you will be as young as your son." To Sushil, she said, "From tomorrow, you are going to be as old as your father." Both father and son were delighted.
Usually, old Subal could never get any sleep towards the early part of the night, but around dawn he was fast asleep and slept late. But when the sun rose the next morning, he almost jumped out of bed and discovered that he had grown quite small. The teeth he had lost were all back. The clothes he had been wearing were too big for him now. His shirt sleeves were longer than his arms and almost touched the floor. His dhoti swept the floor, and he almost tumbled in it. Sushil, who woke up at the crack of dawn and ran about the house, was hardly able to open his eyes. When he finally did succeed in shaking off his sleep, it was only because his father was making such a racket outside. Sushil woke up to find that his clothes were really tight. Nearly half his face was covered with a salt and pepper beard and moustache. There was no trace of hair that had covered his head. He was shocked to discover a gleaming bald pate in its place. What seemed even stranger was that he did not want to get out of bed, as he did on other days. He yawned, turned over on his side, and decided to stay in bed. Both father and son had got exactly what they had wished for. What they had not anticipated were the complications. In the past, Sushil had always thought that once he was old and independent, he'd spend his entire time climbing trees, swimming in the pond, and roaming wild with his friends all day long. There would be no one to stop him from doing what he wanted. When he woke up that morning, he felt no urge to climb trees. He spread a mat on the veranda and sat there lost in thoughts. Finally, he decided that he should not give up the things he was fond of. He stood up and decided to try his usual antics. He went to a nearby olive tree and made several attempts to climb it. He was astounded to find that climbing a tree was beyond him now. After several attempts, he hung on to one of the lower branches, which gave way under his weight and broke into two. He lay flat on the ground. Passers-by were amazed to see an old man trying to climb a tree, and when they saw him rolling on the ground, they burst out laughing. Sushil's friends, who had played with him just the previous evening, took one look at the grouchy old man and ran for their lives. They had no idea that it was Sushil himself. Sushil used to think that the moment he was old and independent, he would play with his friends all day long. But now the very sight of Gopal, Akshay, Harish and Nanda put him in a bad mood. He hated the thought of their noisy games and did not want them to disturb him. You would remember, of course, that once upon a time, Subal had told himself that if he ever got back his lost childhood, he would lock himself up in his study and pore over his books all day long. Now that he was young again, he hated the very thought of studying or going to school. Sushil was very angry with him and said, "Father, aren't you going to school today?" Subal looked down, scratched his head, and said, "I can't. I've got a stomachache." "Stomachache?" said Sushil angrily. "Don't try your tricks on me. I used to get a similar stomachache to avoid going to school." Sushil had known so many different ways of playing truant, and the memory was still so fresh in his mind that it was quite impossible for his poor father to fool him. Sushil forced his young father to go to school. When Subal returned in the evening and longed to go out and play, it was time for old Sushil to wear his glasses and read the Ramayana aloud to himself. Subal's noisy presence disturbed him, so he made Subal sit in front of him and do the sums. He selected such tough and complicated problems that it took his young father more than an hour to solve just one of them. In the evening, Sushil played chess with the old men in the locality. Sushil was particularly careful about food. When his father Subal was an old man, he had a lot of digestive problems. The slightest overeating would bring in an attack of acidity. Sushil remembered it very well and stopped his young father from eating his fill. Subal, on the contrary, was perpetually hungry these days and felt he would be able to digest even a piece of stone. However, Sushil just would not allow him to eat normally, and Subal remained hungry. He started losing weight and grew thin. Old Sushil also had his own problems. He soon realized that nothing of what used to be his second nature suited him anymore. The irregular hours gifted him a cold cough and severe body ache, and he had to remain in bed for 3 whole weeks. Young Sushil had loved to take his daily dip in the pond, but the moment he tried it now, his rheumatism increased so alarmingly that he had to see a doctor for 6 months. He now bathed at home in warm water, and that too on alternate days, and refused to let Subal bathe in the pond as well. He would pick up the comb by mistake to comb his hair, and end up scratching his bald pate. Subal too forgot at times that he was no longer old. He would go and join a gathering of old people and comment on their discussions. Needless to say, it would annoy them very much. They boxed his ears, scolded him for being precocious, and told him to go away. Forgetting that he did not look old, he would ask his tutor for a puff of tobacco. The tutor caned him soundly and made him stand on one leg as a punishment for his impertinence. Sometimes Subal would go and smack Sushil, as before. The elderly Sushil would flare up and say, "Is this the kind of manners they're teaching you in school these days? How dare you?" Enough was, after all, enough. Subal now prayed with all his heart that he might regain his lost age and independence, which he had been foolish enough to pass on to Sushil. Sushil too prayed earnestly that he might become young once again and play around with his friends the way he used to. The goddess who grants wishes heard them both.
"Well," she said, appearing before them, "are you satisfied?"
Yes, yes, indeed we are,
cried both father and son, falling at her feet.
Please change us back to what we used to be once again.
"Very well then,"
said the goddess.
"that's what will happen when you wake up tomorrow morning."
The next day, Subal woke up as an old man, and Sushil found himself young once again. Each of them felt that he had just woken up from a bad dream. Subal raised his voice and asked, "Sushil, why aren't you studying your grammar aloud?" Sushil scratched his head and replied,
Father, I've lost my book.